Go. Okay. Zechariah chapter 14. Isn't it interesting? It's the preface for this, or the subtitle for this, is the coming day of the Lord. And all I can think of is today we were blessed by our bells to hear Days of Elijah.
Right, I love that. I wish we had the lyrics with it.
And yes, I do too, because this is what the lyrics of the Days of Elijah are about. It's really very cool. And if you've never heard the song, I encourage you to go onto YouTube or whatever and just search it out. It is such a neat song, and the title, not just the verses, but the refrain is outstanding.
Riding on a cloud.
Yeah. So we are going to hear this of now. I'm going to preface this with the coming of the Lord. Of course, here in Zechariah, if you remember, we've been talking about this the last couple of weeks, and that is when we hear about the coming day of the Lord, or the great and glorious day of the Lord. Zechariah is not talking about Judgment Day. We can apply it to Judgment Day, but Zechariah is talking about the coming day is the coming of the Messiah. So when we look at this, we can apply it to both. There's nothing wrong with that. But we don't want to ignore the coming of the Messiah for Judgment Day. So, and really, I had a professor teach it to me in this way. It's not that the day of judgment is insignificant. It's just that it is inevitable. It is inevitable because God kept His promise and Jesus came, in His first coming. And because He came, and because He conquered, the day of judgment, it's as if it already happened. In that sense, that's what he was trying to say. And he used to speak the same way of Easter Sunday. It was interesting. He said, so often we put all of our emphasis in the church on Easter Sunday. And he said, when you think about it, the emphasis of the church should be on which day? Good Friday. Why?
That's when it happened.
That's the day that it was finished. And because Good Friday happened, Easter Sunday is inevitable. But if He hadn't risen from the dead, then it wouldn't be that. It's true. That is true. However, the professor's point was because He died, rising was going to happen. It was because the ultimate mission of Christ was to die, and so the resurrection was inevitable, and so that was. There you go. Thank you. What did you do? Have them in your pocket or something, or?
No, somebody just bring it.
Oh, okay. No, that's okay. That's good. Wave to everybody on the camera, by the way. Okay. and happy anniversary today. What is it? 7 years today that we've been together?
Yes.
7. So happy anniversary to Mung Hope. Okay. All right. So that is, and so that is why when we talk about Judgment Day, we can't look at Judgment Day separate from the cross, because Judgment Day is a day that is, again, I don't have any other word for it other than inevitable, because of the cross. And so that when we see that great and glorious day, in fact, we heard about it today in our epistle lesson, right, from Acts. And when Peter talks about Joel's prophecy, and in Joel's prophecy it talks about the great and glorious day of the Lord, he was not speaking of Judgment Day. He was speaking of the cross. That was Joel's prophecy, was that it was at the cross that that was that great and glorious day where the moon would be turned to blood and all of those kind of things, and so that was that's just something I want you to understand as we come into this 14th chapter. So let us get our way through it. The first 7 verses. Does somebody want to read the first 7 verses?
Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations, as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward, and the other half southward. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azal. And you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. On that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost, and there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. Okay.
So, very interesting. We see in here, really, we see reference to Jesus coming, his first coming, but we also get a little glimpse of his second coming in here in the final verse, in verse 6 and 7. So that's really, again, as we talked about Zechariah speaking of the coming of the Messiah, when we look at the coming of the Messiah, we're looking at both comings always, which is why Advent, we always talk about Advent. We talk about both comings as well as how he comes to us veiled in sacrament, but we always talk about it first and second coming together. So, behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil will be taken from you and divided in your midst. Okay. So here we look at it as that can apply both to his Jesus first coming, when he comes to battle sin, death, and Satan, when he comes to and also it can be looked at as the second coming, when he comes to destroy death, the death forever. We can also see this, though, as what goes on throughout the life of the church. So, what went on with the people during the days of Zechariah. Zechariah was one of the contemporary prophets during the time of the exile to Babylon, right? And so we will see, we see here how God, behold, a day is coming when the spoil will be taken from you and divided in your midst. And we see how the God's people were captured, taken into captivity, right? Punished by God. Then what? They were returned. That's where Zechariah comes in. They are returned. And in their return, what happens to their enemy, the enemies of God's people? They would be destroyed. They would, and this is a rhythm that we saw with God throughout all of history, and that we will see with God in history until his second coming, and that is that God will use and has used surrounding nations to punish his people. And he did it with the northern kingdom with Assyria. He did it with the southern kingdom here in Babylon, with Babylon. But then what happens when he does that, he turns around then and he punishes those nations that punish his people. Because the Lord is the one that has given them over to the nations, and yet the nations don't recall and don't call upon the Lord as the one who has given them the nations, and so he punishes them too. And so we have seen that throughout history, and there's no reason to think that we won't see that to going forward. It is one of those things that we as the United States, as we become more and more and more godless, as we have become totally separated from God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, might God someday use other nations to punish us? It is very possible. It is very, and there's no reason to think that it wouldn't or couldn't happen. I think we as the United States, we can become so arrogant in who we think we are as the greatest nation in all of the world, that we think that if that ever comes, well, that will be the day of judgment. Well, maybe not. Maybe Judgment Day doesn't come just because the United States becomes so godless, because there's a whole world out there where the gospel is to be proclaimed. Maybe we as the United States become, we go under God's wrath and punishment by other nations, other godless nations. You could probably even name some of them right now that are, my guess, are eyeballing, the weakness of our nation and hoping one day to be able to pounce upon it. And so we see that God has used, he uses evil for his own good. He doesn't cause evil to happen, but he uses it for his own good. How did he use evil during the days of Zechariah and using Babylon? How did he use evil for good?
And force them to come to terms with who they were and what they were doing.
It would lead them to repentance, to where they certainly didn't have the power to be able to overthrow those nations, and so they were helpless except for calling upon God and repenting, and so God uses that to call to repentance, and of course. He forgives, he restores, and they sin again. And we, the same thing, So we see the rhythm, that rhythm going forever. Well, we're seeing that in here where he's talking to the day that is coming when those enemies of his people are going to also be punished. I will gather the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be taken, houses plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then, so there we saw how the enemy will take the city, God's people, and but that there will be a remaining. There will be a group that will not cave in. They will stay faithful to God. And then, verse 3, the Lord will go out and fight those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. And so it says, now what it says is the Lord will be the one that will fight the nations on behalf of the people, and they will suffer. So we have seen it happen where they have suffered here where those nations have been destroyed or taken over. So we saw that. We talked about that in when we were studying Daniel, how the Babylon was taken over by the Medes and all of that, right? And so we talked about those kind of things. But it also speaks of that time when he will come and he will punish them eternally. So again, you can apply this, Zechariah's words because they are God's promise. And so we can see his promise fulfilled both before the coming and after the second coming. And then he says, he will stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split from two to east and west by a very wide valley. And he talks about the mountains moving to create this valley. This is picture language. This is not something where Zechariah is using this as a literal, he's going to split the mountain and separate it. We remember this same language from Isaiah, and we remember it when the Messiah was to come, right? The Messiah was to come. What was to happen just before the Messiah was to come? Do you remember? There was going to be someone coming before the Messiah. Yeah, the forerunner, right? Do you remember, even if it's a paraphrase, do you remember what was going to happen when the forerunner came?
Every valley should be lifted up and every mountain made low.
Yeah, every valley lifted up, every mountain made low. The pathway was to be leveled, right? So that there would be a direct, an easy path to what? To the Messiah, to the cross. This is the language that Zechariah is using. That God is going to do what? God is going to separate the mountains. He's going to raise the valley, and he's going to create safe passage for his people in the midst of their enemies. And that's what he's talking about here. And so and again, as picture language, you can apply it to the coming of the Messiah the first time. You can apply it to the coming of the Messiah at judgment the same way. Okay? So it's really very interesting. And as you flee from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah King Judah, then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Okay, so here we see, again, the coming of the Messiah. We also can see the second coming of the Messiah, and this will remind us of those words of Paul, right? When Jesus comes again at the second coming, what will happen when he comes? It says that the trumpets will sound and all the dead will rise and they will come with him. And then and those that have died in Christ will meet, and then we will come or those that are still here are going to meet with them. And so this is all part of that same language. This is just Old Testament language, as you saw Paul using in the New Testament as he speaks of the second coming. And so again, we see because we can't separate the first and the second comings, because one makes the other inevitable, you can make the application to all. And then, of course, we come to 6 and 7, which those words should sound familiar to you. On that day there shall be no light or cold or frost. There will be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening there shall be light. What does that sound like?
Sounds like the beginning, like in Genesis.
Sounds like that's interesting. I never thought about that. There is some, you can see, so the new creation, you can look at it as the new creation. Where else did we see similar language to this? Revelation. Yes, and we just had it a couple of weeks ago in our pericope text, in that there would be when on that day when Jesus comes, and there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and there will be no more sun or moon or stars. Why? Because there's no need for it. There will be no night, because the light of the Lamb will light the city. And so we see that language here, right? So this is all prophecy. Everything that Zechariah is saying here is prophetic words, and it speaks of the coming of the Messiah. And we can look at it both ways. First coming, second coming. Now, let's go to verse 8 through 11.
On that day, living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, and his name one. The whole land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site, from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. And it shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security.
Okay. And so, again, this is all picture language that we can look at. We see second coming with this. We can also look at it from a first coming standpoint too, and because Jesus had taken upon himself sin and death and Satan, and he had destroyed that, and because of that, all the rest of this is inevitable, and that would be Philippians language. So we'll just take a look at a couple of the things that are in here. Verse 8. If somebody wants to just go to Revelation chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. If somebody just wants to read that out. Revelation 22, verse 1 and 2.
Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month.
Okay. All right. So, does that language sound familiar to verse 8? Right? In verse 8, on that day, living water shall flow out from Jerusalem. And here, remember, Revelation 22 speaks of the New Jerusalem, right? And so half of it half of them to the eastern sea, half of them to the western sea, and it will continue it will be continual. It'll be in the summer and in the winter. That's what it means. It's continuous. And so we see Revelation chapter 22 in those words of verse 8. And then in the words of verse 9, the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. Now, somebody go to Philippians chapter 2. Verses, and then read that for everybody, verses 9 through 11. Philippians chapter 2.
Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth.
We see Paul's words from Philippians, don't we? That the Lord, that he will reign over all, that his name will be the name that is above all names. And if we were to preface that before we get to verse 9 in Philippians, and we would begin at the 5th verse or the 6th verse, you would see why that is occurring. It is occurring because he has suffered, he has joyfully taken upon himself the cross. Therefore, and that's what the therefore is for. So, again, that's why when you take a look at the second coming, don't separate the second coming from the first coming. Because the second coming is there because of the first coming. The second coming doesn't happen if it isn't for the first coming. And so we see that in verse 9. And then it says, the whole land shall be turned into a plain. And when it says that, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there's going to be no mountains or no terrain in heaven, right? What is it when we start talking about the plain? It's when we talk about the level ground. It is the fact that it's not a rocky road. It's not a struggle. It will not be a struggle for God's people. That it is on the plains that they are at rest, right? Or that they graze. You know, we look at the plains in the in the central or the western part of our state. That's where the animals graze, and and all of that, and we see in the Sermon on the Plain, that is where they all were kind of lounging at rest, and they were with the Messiah, and he was teaching them, he's caring for them. It's almost like Psalm 23 language. You know what I mean? That's what you're seeing in here. Jerusalem will remain aloft, right? But Jerusalem will be lifted high. And remember, at this time of Zechariah, Jerusalem is up on a temple mount. So from the surrounding areas, you can't miss where the temple is, right? You could see it from miles and miles and miles away. But now when we talk about the New Jerusalem in the second coming, what's the New Jerusalem? It's the church, yes. So it's no longer a temple mount, but the New Jerusalem, it'll be high and lifted up, which means what? It means that all will see God. God's going to lift up his people. It is going to be they're going to be visible. So interesting, and I don't want to read too much into this. However, you take a look at one of the parables of Jesus, Jesus talked about the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, right? You remember that parable? Okay, so Lazarus dies, right? Lazarus is where? He's in heaven. Rich man dies. What? And what does the rich man do? The rich man can he see Lazarus? Yes. Can Lazarus see the rich man? No. So, as you look at that and as you think about this, with the New Jerusalem being lifted up for all to be able to see, when you look at the second coming, when you look at heaven, might that mean that those that are not in heaven, will they be able to see what they're missing for eternity? But in heaven, will you be able to see the misery of what is going? Yeah. You see what I mean? It's really interesting, and it's not something that you can define to say, okay, this is what's going to happen in heaven. But we see a couple of different accounts of where what it takes place in heaven is seen. And this is one of those where Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem, the church is going to be lifted up.
Is that the church triumphant?
The church triumphant, yeah. That would be, yeah, absolutely. It is the church triumphant. And but can we, as we kind of stretch this as far as we can stretch it before it breaks, we take a look at the church today. Is the church lifted up today? Yeah, it is. God has lifted up his church today, even though maybe the world denies it, but he has lifted up his church. He has promised that this that this earth is still existing, that this time before the second coming is still existing for the purpose of the church only. Right? It is for the church. It is for the mission of the church. And we talked about this a little bit in our Bible class, the recorded one for this week, and that is that the church's role of proclaiming Christ crucified and resurrected is the reason that Judgment Day isn't here yet. Is that there are still places to proclaim. There are still people to be saved. And so God preserves this earth for his church. He has lifted the church up, and all of this is for them. And the same thing when we gather, we've talked about this before, when we gather in the Lord's house, we've talked about that as being lifted up. That he lifts us up here. That's what it means to be made holy. It's to be set apart. And so he sets you apart. He lifts you up in this place. And so you can see all of that language as you, like I said, as you stretch and as you meditate and you ponder on God's words, and really the fullness of his words. And it shows us that Zechariah is not just speaking directly to the people that are rebuilding the temple, but that God has spoken those words to all of his church. See, this is language that he is speaking to all of his church from that time till the end of time. Okay, now let us go from verse 12 to, I think we can go all the way to the end of the chapter. Let's break it up though. Let's do 12 to 15. Let's do 12 to 15.
This is the plague with which the Lord will strike all the
Okay. I hope you weren't taking a bite to eat while that was going on. So again, I mean, take a look at this language, and as we certainly can apply it to. We certainly can apply it to the second coming, but it really falls on what happens at the cross. It is at the day of the cross that sin and death and Satan has faced this ultimate judgment. And so while they are not experiencing it in its fullness, they are experiencing their fate. And what is that? What is the fate? Is that the plague? And interesting how he uses the word as a plague, kind of like leprosy, right? That their flesh is going to rot, their eyes are going to rot in their sockets, their tongue is going to rot in their mouths, and yet they're not going to die. They're not going to die. This is an eternal punishment that God is speaking about, this is what he will do to those who have destroyed who have persecuted his church. This is how God sees you. This is the kind of love that God has for you, in that his vengeance will be poured out on any and all that have attacked you. Spiritually, physically. This is remarkable language, especially spiritually. So, that's why we see sin and death and Satan and the world and this is, on that day, a great panic from the Lord shall fall upon them, so that each will seize the hand of another. Jerusalem, even Judah will fight at Jerusalem. The wealth of all the surrounding nations will be collected, gold, silver, garments in great abundance, and the plague will fall on all of creation. And so what will happen is all that the world has, that the sinful, unbelieving world has, everything that Satan and his unbelievers have gathered, it'll all be ripped away from them. It is all going to be taken from them. And what they are going to have in exchange for that is they are going to have, in essence, rotting flesh. Picture language, please. Rotting flesh and no death. Now think about the opposite of that he has spoken of for those who believe. He talks about those who believe as having no suffering and perfect bodies. That is heaven. It is for those that have suffered. They will be made new. He uses the term made new again. In new and perfect bodies. So we don't understand. So again, you're seeing the picture language of what is inevitable for the unbeliever and what is inevitable for the believer. And that's what's playing out in this language. Okay?
Why does he single out the tribe of Judah?
That's a good idea. What tribe of Judah? Northern kingdom, southern kingdom. Southern. What was in Judah? What was in the city of Judah? What was in the town of Judah? Try Jerusalem, just south of Jerusalem. Bethlehem. What was in Bethlehem?
Jesus was born.
The first coming. Yeah, the great and glorious day of the Lord. Yes.
So it's because
Jesus
was from the tribe of
Yeah. It's picture language. That's the best way to talk about it. Is that it's picture language. Judah, that Bethlehem, that's the coming of the Lord. It is the head of the church. It is why Jerusalem. It's why they use the term Jerusalem as being the New Jerusalem. It has nothing to do with that plot of ground. It has all to do with that is the church. Okay, so that is why you. So what does it mean by when it talks about all of Judah? It means all of the church, right? That's what he is speaking of. Okay, so let's go from the 16 to the end of the book.
Then the survivors from all the nations that had attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, and to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. If any of the peoples of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, they will have no rain. If the Egyptian people do not go up and take part, they will have no rain. The Lord will bring on them the plague he inflicts on the nations that do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. On that day, holy to the Lord will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, and the cooking pots in the Lord's house will be like the sacred bowls in front of the altar. Every pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to the Lord Almighty. And all who come to sacrifice will take some of the pots and cook in them. And on that day there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord Almighty.
Okay. So here we can see the language of Zechariah's day. We can also see the language. We can see it here in regards to the church after the first coming. We can also see it after the second coming as we take a look at these words. Everyone who survives those nations that have come against Jerusalem. So who is that? Everyone that survives those nations. In the time of Zechariah, that would be what? The remnant, right? That survived Babylon. All right. What does it mean? You know, who is he speaking about after the first coming? He is speaking about the church, the believers today, the remnant, or the diaspora is another term for that remnant. That would be us. Right? He is speaking of us. Or he is speaking of, if you look in the second coming, it would be the church triumphant. Those that have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb, as Revelation would say. He is speaking of those. They will go up and they will worship the King. And they will keep the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, right? That was that harvest feast is what it was. And there they will, and at that harvest feast, what do? They bring the first fruits to the harvest feast, and so that's what he is saying here to the people that are coming from Babylon. Come to the feast, bring your first fruits into the tabernacle of the Lord. He is saying that to us, the church. Come and gather, right, into the church. Bring your first fruits into the tabernacle and gather at the feast. And then, of course, on that day of the great, that second coming, we see all will be gathered around, and we remember the picture of that was in Revelation. All will be gathered around the throne of the Lamb, and they will be offering worship, and they will have presented themselves holy and blameless. That's the first fruits. So again, you can picture these languages when you're talking prophesic literature. This is we don't want to take a look at it in a literal, but we look at it from how it applies to the whole church through all time, so that and those it says for those who don't believe, those who don't gather at the feet of the Lord in worship, that they will be there will be a punishment to them. Pam had said, verse 19. Well, before them, there will be no rain, and the plague with the Lord afflicts the nations that don't go to keep that Feast of Booths. It's that God does not rain down his blessings upon them. In fact, we saw a couple of verses earlier that they are going to be facing, a leprosy type of disease forever, right?
The Feast of Booths is the same as the Feast of the Tabernacle?
Yeah, the Feast of Tabernacle is the Feast of Booths. Yeah.
And today, Pentecost is the Feast of
Tabernacle.
It's the Feast of the Tabernacle today. So because then they brought their barley, the first fruit.
Yeah.
And that was, did they have more than one Feast of Tabernacle?
No, this was the one. This was the one. This was the annual Feast of Booths. Yeah. The annual Feast of Tabernacle.
Do they still celebrate that today?
Probably. A good Orthodox Jews. I know they used to, because there was an Orthodox community really close to Mount Calvary, and there used to be times when they would have their little tabernacles or their little booths or tents outside of the synagogue area that they would gather. Now, they wouldn't be on a Sunday, right?
Saturday.
Yeah, it would have been Friday night and Saturday, right? Absolutely. Yeah, but Sunday, there would have been absolutely that they would have had their little tabernacles outside. I don't know if that still happens, but I know it used to, because I remember it when I was at Sherman Park. So, and then here, interesting though, as we close out here, every pot in Jerusalem and Judea shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. So we see this language that all who believe will be part of that great feast. That's the language. And there shall no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. Or Pam, what was your word? It was no longer the last verse. No longer Canaanite. Okay, no longer an unbeliever in the house of the Lord on that day. Yeah. So in heaven, there will be no more, there's no fear of sin. It will be gone. So, prophesic language, that the entire last chapters of the book. So, all right? Any questions on this?
Every pot in Jerusalem, meaning common things, right?
Every pot. It means again. This is feast. This is kind of like what we would call feast language. Isaiah spoke about gathering together at the feast, at the table. Jesus would even speak some of that language. I'm not going to eat again with you until that great day, but there's always, when we speak of heaven is described as the great wedding banquet, the great feast. So it's really that kind of language that we see here, is that every pot, every feast that is in every individual home is all going to be part of the one feast. So again, don't take it literal. Take it as prophesic language. Okay?
And
So.
what language will we speak in heaven?
I don't know.
Will we all, maybe we'll still speak English, but everybody will be able to understand us, and we'll be able to understand.
Why
you.
English? Why would it be? Why would it be English?
Because that's what I
Be-
speak.
because there you go. It's like the Reverend John Seleska, who's passed away now, and former seminary professor, former professor at Concordia University, and I've talked about it before. How he memorized the entire Bible, couldn't stump him at all. But he would make the comment, he would say, they asked him which version, and he said the King James Version, because that's the version we're going to have in heaven. So again, when you talk about the English language, why English? I don't. We don't know.
I think we'll be able to read each other's minds.
It will be a great and glorious day. So, go in peace, serve the Lord, and what we'll do is we are going to dive into New Testament, of course, starting in the fall, because we just finished Old. We've been trying to flip back and forth. And so we will go into some New Testament, probably some of the New Testament epistles. We did all the John work. Maybe we'll do either some of the Peter work, 1st and 2nd Peter, or maybe we should do some Paul. I'm not sure, but we'll dive into something New Testament in fall, and then we'll begin again. So enjoy your summer, and go in peace and serve the Lord. And please just remember, if you want to exit, you can go out the original exit here. That's fine. Or you can go up the stairs and down the stairs if you want to that way. It is your call. Just don't go out this door because it's hard for me to close.